Greetings. So this video is going to be a follow-up to the video that I had yesterday, which explored the question, how old is the claim of Hebrew on the pews? So, this video builds upon that. It's an epilogue to that, and so it sort of moves forward, assuming that the viewer has already seen that video from yesterday. Okay, enjoy. As a bit of an epilogue, I'd like to share that after making the video you just saw, I looked into this a bit more, trying to search for various sources discussing the markings on the pews. So I'd like to share what I've found with you now. I'll put some excerpts from various books and articles on the screen, and the precise sources will also be listed in the video description. Of course, you can also pause your video if you wish to take a closer look at what appears on the screen, as we'll be running through some of the sources quite quickly. So I came across a book from 1994 which claimed that the markings were the signatures of those who had worked on the pews. Then I came across an article in the Florida Times-Union from February of 1998, which described them as African tribal markings. Another article in the Washington Post from August of that same year, which is to say 1998, likewise described them as tribal markings, representing the signatures of those who made the pews. Then there is a 2003 article from the magazine Southern Living, which once again described them as tribal markings. So too, there was a book from 2005 which also described them as tribal markings and added that such markings were, that they formed a kind of common language. Yet another book from 2006 likewise made reference to tribal markings with the added detail that they conveyed 6 different languages. I actually wrote to one of the co-authors of that book, and she informed me that the statement was repeating what a tour guide at the church had said back then, back when the book was being written. So with all of that before us, here's the impression that I got from the various sources we consulted. So here's a rough timeline of the claims over the recent decades. So first, as was covered in the beginning, in the 1970s, and perhaps so too the 1980s, the markings were described as, quote, African scribble-scrabble, or also as drawings. Then in the 90s and the early noughties, which is to say the early part of the first decade of the 2000s, they were described as African tribal markings and even like a type of signature, the signatures of people who built the pews. And then in the mid to late noughties, again the mid to late 2000s, the sources begin to make more explicit references to languages, right? And it's around this time that I find the earliest references to Hebrew. And then, as you know, there are others who also go on to propose Aramaic, Arabic, or Ge'ez. Whatever the case, at this point, it seems to me like the various sources capture a sort of evolution in the claims about the markings on the pews, with the claim of specifically Hebrew coming up in the early 2000s. However, I admit that is highly speculative, and thus, if we stopped here, the proposal just made should be considered as having a reasonable margin of error, perhaps a significant margin of error. But then I came across another source, which seemed to corroborate the conclusion I was tentatively inferring from the other sources I consulted. An article from August of 2008 in a British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, stated the following regarding the markings on the pews at First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. Quote, "For many years, these marks were a puzzle, but it is now thought that they may be cursive Hebrew." End quote. That line struck me as quite a strong piece of evidence, as we have an article from the late noughties, which is, again, to say the late 2000s, precisely at the time that we seem to see the claims of Hebrew appear in the available sources. And that article alludes to the conclusion that the marking, this conclusion that the markings are Hebrew was at that time only recently arrived at. In short, this article from 2008 seems to corroborate the speculation that the claim of Hebrew on the pews was a recent innovation dating to the first decade of the 21st century. Now, of course, the discussion does not stop here. Perhaps others can bring different lines of evidence to the table, and we can continue to explore the subject. On our end, we are certainly going to continue to look into this matter. But As was stated earlier, at this point, we should not be expected to just take someone's word for it when they assert that the claim of Hebrew on the pews has always existed with the church. That doesn't seem to be the case when we're examining the available evidence. Food for thought. On that note, God bless.
I like something the other brother said, and he brought up the thing. Shout out to the boo. Shout out to Faithful. He brought up something about them pews, and he was talking about them pews. Boy, dialogue got to go on. He said, how long these people been saying this Hebrew? You can't come and tell me this one thing about no pew. Yeah, I'm going to bring them up too. You can't tell me one thing when somebody said it was this, somebody said it was that, somebody else said it was this. No, a lot of y'all got agenda.